These are in listen-only mode.
Good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, part of the highly acclaimed series of webinars at ACP, the Association of Contingency Planners, presents for both current and future members. For more information about ACP, please visit www.acp-international.com. My name is Ed Goldberg, and it is my honor to host these webinars. My thanks to Alyssa Hatch and ACP's headquarters staff at ADG in Albany, and our good friends at Continuity Housing for their roles as webinar experts who work behind the scenes to ensure that these webinars happen flawlessly. And a big thanks to our webinar series sponsor, Continuity Housing. Continuity Housing guarantees pre-negotiated hotel rooms at substantial savings for the critical employees of larger and mid-sized companies in order to help prevent a business disruption in the event of a crisis. They've created a patent-pending guaranteed employee housing program which secures and protects hotel rooms for critical personnel and their families if needed, while saving companies significant expense. Continuity Housing has a 100% success record with their deployments, and each member of their team has at least 10 years of experience in the hotel industry. For information on receiving a free 30-minute consultation about your deployment housing needs, visit continuityhousing.com or leave a comment in the survey that'll pop up at the end of this webinar. This and previous webinars are recorded, and they're made available on our ACP website. Please feel free to share the link to the recordings with your peers and anyone you think who might benefit from it. You will receive a link to the recording after the webinar via email, along with additional information on the topical content. And please help us out if you would. If you have an idea for a webinar topic, please send it to me or to michelle.lowther@continuityhousing.com. We'll be taking questions at the end, so please share them with me in the question box in your control panel anytime during the presentation. I'll jot them down, and then we'll hopefully have time to use them during the Q&A session. Moving your data center to the cloud or to a new cloud provider can be a very difficult process, requiring a lot of careful planning. CheerPoint Director of Sales Engineering, Christian Lappin, will lead a session that will help the audience be more prepared to not only move to the cloud, but to the right type of cloud. He'll also share steps to make sure your data and applications are protected and backed up in the event that something happens unexpectedly during a migration. The takeaways from today's session, the questions you should ask your cloud provider before you sign a contract, the essential elements of a pre-migration checklist, are you moving to the right type of cloud, the process of cloud migration, what actually is happening during a move, real stories from helping numerous clients make their move. Our speaker today is Christian Lappin. He's the Director of Sales Engineering at CheerPoint. Christian frequently speaks about cloud technology and how it helps organizations better protect and manage their data assets. Additionally, he serves as an active member of the FBI InfraGard Task Force and the American Red Cross Disaster Services Team. Christian has more than 15 years of infrastructure experience and is both an informative and entertaining presenter, and he occasionally breaks out his skills as a professional magician. Please join me in welcoming Christian Lappin.
Thank you very much, and good morning or good afternoon, depending upon where you're viewing this presentation from. So today we have a lot of information that I'm very excited to be able to share with you guys. Primarily, we're going to be focusing around how to do a major move to get in and out of cloud or in and out of an actual data center to the cloud, ideally without getting an ulcer. So in order to do that, big events require big planning. Now I've got a brief video here that I'd like to play for you guys to kind of show you the size and scope of what could easily represent as a major challenge that a lot of you may have to look at. Hopefully not all of you are planning large moves like this one with the actual Space Shuttle, but you can see here from the video that even with a little bit of planning came some inherent challenges. So we'll just go ahead and view this here briefly.
Space Shuttle Endeavour had flown 25 missions to outer space. When it was retired, it was flown on a custom 747 to Los Angeles, on its way to the California Science Center. It was then placed on a heavy-duty dolly system designed to navigate the streets of LA. But after traveling 122 million miles, the one thing the Shuttle Endeavour couldn't do was cross the 405 freeway. The motorized dolly was too heavy for the bridge, so we proposed that Daytona runs with a stock Toyota Tundra straight off the lot. But first, we had to convince NASA, both the California Transit Authority and the City of Los Angeles, that we could do it.
And as I'm sure all of you know, that happened successfully and without a hitch. So that is a great example of what happens time and time again with a DR plan or with a move. You can try to plan for everything, but usually at the end of the plan or during a test, there's always going to be something that comes up that causes a problem or that causes a shift in focus or a shift in actual direction. Next example here, Google executive jumped from a balloon at the edge of the atmosphere, nearly 136,000 feet up in the air, completely beating out the prior record there from the Red Bull team. So again, just goes to show that pretty much any event, any feat, anything can easily be accomplished, not necessarily easily, but can be accomplished with the right amount of planning. Now to kind of bring this into focus, a lot of times what happens when folks are looking to make that move to the cloud is they say, okay, I've got X amount of data, whether that be a few gigs or, in this example, 10 terabytes of data inside of my data center or perhaps on-prem, and I need to move into the cloud. How am I going to do that? All of these things, and especially that move, all require planning. And obviously, the more planning that you have, the more exposure to other folks' prior challenges are really going to enable you to be able to accomplish these things. So before you sign an agreement, before you enter into a contract, what are some of the things that you should really be focusing on? You really want to do excessive due diligence before you enter into any kind of agreement. Now, this could be geared specifically toward cloud and managed services, or alternatively, this could also be geared toward physical colocation. The number one item on the list, as you can see here, is security and compliance. So the reason that this comes up, even for verticals and specific industries that aren't bound or tied to a specific security protocol or a specific compliance, more and more companies, more and more organizations are really looking toward things, such as PCI, for example, as a way to get a documented workflow, documented SOPs for both operations and then also for disaster planning and then also disaster mitigation. Bandwidth strain. So obviously things in theory are never going to run as good as they do when they're local, right? So that brings us to our next point, location, location, location. Just like real estate, same goes for cloud and data center. Where you put your data does matter, despite the fact that the cloud is all around us. At the end of the day, depending upon your specific software, applications, and workloads, moving things further away inside of the cloud may introduce latency, which means that that is then going to directly affect your user experience. Often this issue comes to light during a DR test or a DR event, because you think of it as almost insurance. It's not going to be production. Some loss in performance is usually acceptable, but then what happens is that DR event could extend out and your DR site now becomes your production site. Or even if you're just looking at this from a production standpoint of going to cloud or to an actual data center, you still could run into some of the same challenges because of the fact that it might take your users extra time in order to actually get there. Some ways around that are obviously highly evaluating the environment and really looking at not the individual components, but the overall business itself. How do people do their work? How do they interact with their data? And most importantly, how do they access it? Because obviously if you have any kind of workload shift by making this move, that could obviously create problems. From a disaster recovery and business continuity standpoint as well, those can also introduce some significant challenges. How are you going to back up your data? How are you going to recover it? How are you going to put together a plan or most likely modify your plan from what you once had physically on-premise into something that's now inside of the cloud. And then something that you don't really want to think about, but what is your exit strategy? How are you going to exfil, if you will, out of the cloud if you have to? Who owns your data? How do you get the data back? Do you get the whole virtual machine? Do you only get files? Do you get access to it? Is it on you to be able to pull that in and out of the cloud? These are important conversations to have with your potential service provider, because ultimately you want to always maintain control. So you can almost tie the security and compliance point in with the actual exit strategy, because it's importantly paramount to understand who owns what and who's responsible for what. Which then brings us into the cloud. I really don't like using the word cloud because it obviously means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. A lot of people just think of the cloud as this one thing, but what we've really learned over the last few years, because really if you look at most organizations, if you're not already 100% virtualized, you've got a significant portion of your environment already inside of the cloud, which is very important to really break the cloud down into these core components, whether they be IaaS or infrastructure as a service, PaaS, platform as a service, or SaaS, software as a service. Then inside of that, you have different types of physical configurations. So instead of viewing it as cloud as the one, think about it as which ones or which clouds are really going to make the most sense for my specific organization. So as you can see here, there's a lot of overlap. The most popular shift inside of the cloud space right now is what we refer to as hybrid cloud. Hybrid cloud extends ultimately the best of all worlds in that you have the ability to physically tie together and physically interconnect both physical assets with virtual assets. That could be an older legacy mainframe you may have. That could be physical circuits. That could be servers that you're just, honestly afraid, to actually virtualize, right? Because all of us have those systems inside of our environment that, we're afraid to patch or afraid to actively reboot because the thing might not come back. So it's important to look at the cloud landscape as an opportunity to really diversify your environment into different types of configurations for both security, performance, and then obviously scalability as well. So sort of a summary of those three main types of cloud: the infrastructure as a service, the platform as a service, and software as a service. You can really look at and see sort of who does what. So this is really an important starting point when thinking about moving perhaps more of your environment to the cloud, or even changing cloud providers. We're really starting to see within the overall vertical, especially at this point, a lot of folks have already tried out cloud. This isn't their first cloud contract, so they've already had an experience, whether that be positive, negative, or sort of it's not really what I thought, is kind of what we hear a lot. So really important to understand who's doing what and what makes the most sense for your platform or application, because as you can see, there's varying levels of vendor management, whether that be up and through the operating system or up and through everything except the specific applications, or just having everything completely outsourced. Obviously, within each specific cloud product, there are multiple layers of additional management, of course, that you can always layer on. So it's really important to, instead of try to fit your environment into what a vendor has, really draw a line in the sand of what you need, and then find a vendor, find a partner that's going to be willing to actively work with you on that, because it's too hard and really too difficult now to try to force fit your environment into a sort of off-the-shelf product, if you will. So how do we do this? There was a lot of points and a lot of challenges. So what I really wanted to do was kind of break things down for you guys to really kind of help you work your way through the process, if you will. So in order to execute on any kind of project, you really need to have a lot of talks and a lot of conversations internally with all of your specific colleagues, whether that be management, senior leadership, early and often, and then highlight points on how it's going to help the business. Shift the conversation on the front away from dollars and cents and specific technology to specific business benefits, because really at the end of the day we want to utilize and view cloud as a tool or as an opportunity to be able to make a significant shift to business. So obviously talking about ways that will allow the business to focus on what it does best instead of managing infrastructure, cutting down on overall time to market, and then obviously controlling costs and improving customer responses are ultimately the benefits of cloud, but these are also the main drivers inside of the business, because really within all organizations you want to really streamline and shortcut the IT department's lag in being able to deliver service. You want to really help them be able to be quick and nimble to spin services up and to improve the overall business. Next, what you're going to want to do is you're really going to want to inventory all of your system. You want to break everything down into what I like to call cloud-ready components. So instead of thinking of things in their totality of this server, that server, this workstation, so on and so forth, break everything down into components that easily convert and can easily digest into really almost any service provider's cloud. So the sort of low-hanging fruit for this would obviously start with the operating systems, right? Understanding licensing, because licensing can be a whole set of challenges when trying to go to another cloud provider, whether or not you're using Microsoft versus Linux, open license versus SPLA license, so on and so forth. It's important to understand who owns the operating systems, where you are with them in terms of the life cycle, whether or not you have software assurance, really get a good handle on your overall operating system landscape. Then again, shift that focus back. How are you managing the business? What sort of specific middleware do you have? Any kind of database? Is it an old version? Are you looking to actually make, a specific upgrade? Applications, what are the dependencies, both within the software itself and also the environment itself? So it's really important, to almost make an actual spreadsheet of each system and then the components that actually make up that system for the line of business, and then really highlight what it needs in order to run effectively. It's also possible that while you're doing this exercise, there may be, current challenges, whether, there could be not enough memory, there could be not enough RAM, there could be a lot of problems with that. So it's really important, for you to have a really good understanding of that overall system and overall performance. From a management standpoint as well, if you're used to managing everything locally, how could that change, or how will that change if you move those specific workloads up into the cloud? Then from a compute standpoint, looking at the physical hardware, the physical infrastructure itself, how many processors, how many cores, the speed of the I/O, how does the data get from the server back to the storage, the networking. Again, some of these are some of the main overlooked points also when planning out for DR, is you're not really thinking about the core infrastructure needed in order to actually build a network, switching, routing, security, so on and so forth. So it's important to have a really good understanding of everything that these systems need. For storage, the storage and the storage type that you may have locally might not be available inside of the cloud. Are you going to need the same storage for production and DR? You may or may not. Again, it really all comes down to the applications, the users, and how people are going to interact with them. And it's also possible too that during this exercise you may identify older legacy systems that you may no longer need. So those would be really good candidates to actually plan phasing out as you're preparing to actually make this move. So in doing that, it's going to bring you into this next point of being able to assess the overall workloads, really almost kind of look at things under a microscope, if you will, to really tier your application. So after you've identified all of the components, look at the overall operation of the environment and figure out what tier they fall into. So this is actually a very interesting conversation because depending upon who you speak to within the business, I'd be willing to bet that everyone is going to say that their department, their application is tier 1, most critical to the business. Their job, their role within the organization is most critical. Their software, their team, everything is super critical. But in reality, what you're going to find is that you're really going to have a lot of systems that are going to spread across this matrix. So you're going to have some things that, are going to be like that. Like, for example, email. That's pretty commonly considered a tier 1 application, right? So, that would easily fall there. Then next to that, you could look at specific infrastructure, right? So those are going to be the components that are needed to support it, such as additional firewalling, security, antivirus, all of those security products that are really helping to ensure the environment stays up and running. Then you're going to have your tier 3, which are things that you need, but you might not need immediately. And then obviously from there, tier 4, which are some of the nice to haves, not need to haves. So by focusing and breaking your environment down into these tiers, not only are you going to get a really good understanding of your overall business, but this is also going to help you save money and specifically affect your bottom line. Because at the end of the day, especially within IT now, pretty much all departments are heavily being tasked with do more but for less money, or try to cut corners but obviously not cut service. So this really allows you to to stay hyper focused on specific needs and then really take a lot of the emotion out of my department's most important type sort of talks. Now you're almost ready to do your migration. So from here, again, try to find a provider, try to find somebody that you can work with that is going to fit into your needs, not have you have to fit into what it is that they're offering. I can't stress that point enough. So from there, look at across all of the different types of clouds. You may find that you may need a mixture. So it's very unusual now, that everybody's applications are all going to follow the same recovery point objective and recovery time objective, right? So in looking at that, RPOs and RTOs are now starting to shift across multiple tiers. It's very common for your production environment to do the same thing. So traditionally, you would start with your tier 4 workloads first, then migrate over things that are tier 3. A really good way to actually do this is to find providers that offer the hybrid capability, right? Because then you have the ability to have more of a staggered migration, use a move into a data center as almost a baby step in which you can reestablish yourself, and then from there have the ability to, on your timetable, shift and migrate things over that, perhaps are on older legacy hardware that's sort of beyond its actual sell-by date, and then slowly migrate everything else over. Now, once everything is migrated, you're now going to run your business inside of the cloud, so to speak. So who's doing what? This is really when all the question marks come up that, as you saw in the very beginning, we brought them up, and we're bringing them up again because you have the onboarding portion, you have the planning, the migration, so on and so forth, all the steps and stages, but then what you end up with is this environment that it needs to be made very, very clear as to who is doing what. How are the actual bills going to be generated? Are they going to be based on usage or based on time of the virtual machine up? Is it going to be a fixed cost, variable cost? How do you get billed, for overages? Are you notified? And then looking at from a security and compliancy standpoint, who within your organization has the ability to change services, right? Because obviously the whole point of cloud is to be scalable and flexible, but how much of that convenience do you want to extend to your internal team? Do you want to give everybody the ability, to spin up virtual machines? If so, that's great, but also understand that could dramatically affect your bill. So it's really important to understand that there's a good tool set, and you have a really good, well-defined scope of work that is very clearly articulated as to who's doing what and who's supposed to do what. So what are some of the best times in order to move to the cloud? So some of these points here are also some of the benefits of virtualization as well. So as you can see here, hardware refresh cycles. Traditionally, best practice usually sets us around 3 to 4 years. What we're really starting to see is more folks really trying to get more bang for their buck, if you will, and push out to even 5 years plus. Running out of capacity, this we're starting to see more often than not. This was that big rush to push everything virtual, right? So a few years ago, there was the big movement to consolidate, shrink your local footprint, put everything into the cloud locally. A lot of people did that, but then what happens is through virtualization over subscription, what happens then is you almost scale up and out beyond the local capability of your environment. And what happens there is that you're then put into a situation of where you're not being able to maintain N+1, if you will, to maintain the ability to sustain a local failure and then still be able to operate. So then what happens a lot of times in those type of situations is you'll see folks actually utilizing the older infrastructure for DR, right? So that's a way, to really extend the life. You may not want to run production on it, but it should be good enough for DR. So then what happens is you offload and off-shift workloads to your recovery site and run it on infrastructure that's not appropriately sized anymore because your production system grew beyond the overall capability of not only the production system, but especially the DR system. Anytime that you would be perhaps looking to launch new services, this is a great time to look at the cloud, especially in a hybrid approach. If you have something that you're hoping is going to be the next best thing, but you may not have enough budget, to properly build it out, that's a great thing to try out inside of the cloud, because that's one of the #1 cloud benefits is that it allows you to be wrong. Anytime you buy hardware, you almost have to be psychic. You have to think 3, 4, 5 years out into the future to think, well, is this purchase that I'm making today, is this going to be appropriately sized for me 3, 4, 5 years from now? Am I going to be able to grow my business into this server? And what happens is, you end up with a multitude of servers, server sprawl, that if you look at the overall utilization, you're going to be lucky if you're getting 7, to maybe 10% utilization. So you're spending a lot of money on an individual server that you're not able, to fully realize all the benefits. So that's, again, a great reason to look to cloud for those specific point applications. DR in the cloud is huge right now because it allows you to sort of decouple some of those singular site dependencies that used to exist where you had to have like-for-like hardware. Being able to be more portable with your data, again, allows you to shift and pivot, as we saw from the first example with them moving the overall space shuttle. Is they had a very well thought out plan, but they eventually got to a point where they had to be able, to shift and pivot. Same thing happens for DR. Time and time again, you have to be able to shift on the fly. And then obviously with more folks working from home, you need to have the ability to be able to rapidly scale up and scale out. Then obviously starting a new business, or this could even be a new line of business too. Trying things out inside of the cloud, to see if they take off. It's great. So again, to sort of summarize, these are points, you can almost think of these as my advice to all of you when looking at cloud. So again, the most abused point is over provisioning. So that's whether you're doing it yourself or unfortunately the provider that you're looking at may over provision. Even though you are being sold a specific bill of goods, are you sure that those resources are dedicated to you? Or are those resources, you may have to compete with other people inside of that cloud? How are you going to ensure performance? Is there an actual SLA inside of your agreement that is going to ensure that user experience that you're trying to specifically maintain? That of course has to be looked at. It's really difficult when you try to purchase solely based on price with multiple quotes, because it's very rare that you can find two environments that are going to be similar where you're assured that you're going to be getting the same exact things. And obviously costing, look under the hood, ask all those questions, really understand how you're going to be built, understand if you scale, how is that scalability going to work. Understanding downtime as well too, because again, if you're looking at this for production, have to have that high-level conversation around DR. How are you going to get there, and how are you going to get back up in the event of any kind of a major problem? Then obviously, again, don't overlook public cloud, because depending upon your specific situation, public cloud may actually be a great fit for you, especially if you decouple some of your environment and not try to run everything inside of the public cloud. Next, I'm going to show you a few examples. Now, these are a few different ways in which you can migrate into a cloud. These are also some solutions that not only can they be used for cloud migration, but they can also be used for DR. In this first example, we're looking at a product called Zura. The great thing about Zura is that it runs sort of at the hypervisor layer. It allows you to almost stream, if you will, the whole environment or individual machines over to either a new production cloud or to a specific DR site. Also, it's good if you have a mixed environment. So this works great with both Hyper-V as well as VMware. In terms of how it works, you're still going to be doing your overall replication. So as you can see there in bullet point number 1, the data is physically being replicated from one point to another point. When you switch over for a DR test or an actual DR event, you can also see there for point number 2, you have the ability to fail back or run a almost sandbox, if you will, test. Then from there, anything externally facing, so anything inside of DNS that has to be publicly accessible, you're going to make the updates there for point number 3. Our next option is a solution called DoubleTake. This is a great solution because you have the ability to protect an entire virtualized host, or you even have the ability to go into the individual virtual machine guest. So this is a great solution if you're with an existing cloud provider, you're not sure exactly how you're going to get your overall data. As long as you have the ability to install software into that virtual guest, you could install DoubleTake directly into the guest and then get a perfect clone of that virtual machine out. So it's a really good way to move, and it's also a good way to sort of stagger the DR solution, if you will, right? So you can have the ability to be able to have multiple RTOs and RPOs, but still have something specific that allows you to not only protect virtual assets, but also physical. So again, this is a great solution if you have an environment that's a hybrid environment locally, and you have to find a way to actually protect it. Next, we have a solution called EVault, but this could really be any sort of data protection, right? This could be, ComVault, EVault, IP vaulting, pretty much any product out there that provides any kind of overall data backup. But one of the things you have to look at here is time of recovery. How much data do you have? And the most important question is, are you recoverable? And it's important just to kind of pause on that point very briefly, because a lot of organizations have successfully transferred away from tape or even disk-based media, but end up in a state that they have all their data in the quote-unquote cloud. And if you speak to them on that, they're very proud of that fact. I have offsite backup, it's in the cloud, I am all set. But what happens is depending upon the scale of that data, you then have to recover it. So where is that data going to go? How is it going to get there? Who's going to be in charge of that? And if you have a lot of machines and a lot of data, and you've made that actual commitment back to the business that you're going to have everything up and running in an hour or so, that might not just happen. You may get stuck. So it's important to really look at some of these solutions, and hopefully they were able to actually get you thinking about how you can distribute your environment. Now, to sort of put all of this into practice, have a case study for you, because it's great to hear about what you can do, but what everybody wants to know is, how did people specifically execute on this? So as we all know, a disaster serves as a very powerful driver to actually move people into the cloud or off-prem. This example here was a very large national insurance provider that offered almost many versions of cloud to their customers, but they were doing it all on infrastructure that they owned. So they basically got caught up in the virtualize everything locally. They became very highly available, very scalable, and offered to their insurance brokers the ability to do software as a service or platform as a service, or they even had the ability to spin up a semi-dedicated environment for the specific broker. Then the wildfires happened, or as I should say, they continue. So, these have been in the news now, for several months, several years in fact, focusing in and through California. The wildfires have been incredibly devastating, so you can imagine the amount of specific disaster claims that have actually come out of that. Then you run into the reality of sending photos, videos, claim forms. You run into that problem of how are you going to get data from point A to point B. So there became a huge backlog very, very quickly of the inability for clients and brokers to actually get all these data points and have the ability to scale, because as you can see here by the graph, if you only have the equivalent of a T1 and you have 1 terabyte of information, it takes 8 days. So it's a very, very long and painful process. So what they quickly discovered is that by extending the environment that they had up into the cloud, focusing on a hybrid model of where they would be able to do all processing locally but do all of the intake inside of the cloud, now allowed their organization to scale up, become highly distributed, and for once actually be able to stay ahead of the fire. So really at the end of the day, they saw these events as an opportunity to extend what it is that they already did, which is great, into something that's more turnkey and even more flexible. At this point, I'd like to hand it back to the team for any specific questions, because I know we covered a lot of information in an incredibly short amount of time, so I thank you guys for that.
Yeah, good analogy with the fire, because we've all been drinking from the fire hose for a little bit. This is great.
Oh, absolutely.
Lots of questions. Regarding the duration of the planning cycle, what are the major concerns and issues to address in planning to move from or to a cloud?
Sure. Probably the major things to think about during the planning stage are ensuring before you move out of that stage that you have everything documented. Obviously, that's what everyone loves to do, but unfortunately you have to do it. You have to really identify the workload. You have to be able to appropriately identify the whole environment so that way you can move out of that stage.
Great. What are the merits or flaws of downloading all your data to a hard drive and FedExing it to your cloud provider versus sending it over the internet?
Sure. So obviously from a security and compliance standpoint, you could argue that it's being shipped. You could track it, but you're not in full control over it. Plus also that could get lost, right? So even though it has an overall tracking number, I'm sure all of you know of times when things were shipped and then they just never showed up. So it's important to think about how are you going to recover from any kind of actual data set, so whether the data is in the cloud or physically local to you, how are you going to get that somewhere in a short amount of time?
Okay, great. Our business runs around the clock. How do you do a transfer without using up all of my bandwidth for other work that needs to be done?
Excellent question. So during the planning stage, you are going to really identify the systems and most importantly the overall I/O, how data is going to flow from the environment back to the storage. And then what you could most likely do is get a snapshot of the environment, and then from there you only have to worry about backing up or even possibly replicating the specific change data.
Okay. Can a migration operation, well, this is probably similar to the same question. Can a migration operation take place while systems are running, or do they need to be taken offline?
Sure. So the answer to that is yes, they absolutely can. For example, DoubleTake is very good at that. You can almost think of that as a near real-time replication. So that's a way that you can have the environment up and running, and you can even go so far as to script once everything's replicated over, shut down what was once the production environment, and then come up on the actual DR side.
Okay. Is it possible to lease a faster connection temporarily for use during a migration?
It definitely pose a challenge depending upon the providers and actual carriers that you're currently engaged with. They may give you the ability to increase, the speed for that time and then dial it back down. So you should absolutely explore that, because obviously at the end of the day, the goal is to get whatever it is that you have off-site in a complete and secure way as possible.
Okay, good. Say, for example, we're planning a phased approach to moving all our workloads to the cloud in a year. What are the disadvantages or advantages?
So the advantages are that you're already looking at trying to improve your situation by putting more into the cloud. Some of the disadvantages are if you do not provide enough time through the varying phases of actually doing the project, you could end up in a situation where there's been overlooked and they're going to cause you issues. So you really want to think of the time that you need to be done and then do a reverse timeline to ensure that you can hit all the appropriate points in order to accomplish the mission.
Good. Should we expect performance differences from private versus public cloud or multi-tenant private cloud?
So that's a great question, but you should actually know the answer to that yourself because you've had those talks, right? So you asked the questions, you found out what type of storage, what type of environment am I being on? Is this shared or dedicated? So that's a great question that hopefully through the planning stages and through speaking with the varying service providers providers, you're going to actually gain that information yourself.
Okay, good. And I know we're running low on time, so this will be our last question. Anybody asking any questions that we didn't get to, we'll get those to Christian and get with answers to everybody afterwards. I presume that a local backup is a must-do before starting a migration. Is there a checklist of processes that you need to do before you start a migration?
Yes, absolutely. So while it's important to have everything backed up, I highly recommend you doing a specific recovery test before even contemplating migrating, because you really need to ensure the validity of that data and to ensure that it's going to be useful. So I would say that would be the number one thing that I would do. Then once you've achieved that, then from there you can look at figuring out how you're going to get that data to the cloud, and then figuring out how that provider is going to be able to restore it for you.
Very good. Everyone just stick around for just about 30 seconds. We'll get you some information that I think you'll find useful. Christian, first of all, thank you so much. Great presentation. Thank you all for attending today's program and webinar. And thanks once again to Continuity Housing for sponsoring the entire webinar series, and to ADG and their webinar experts for their support of the series. Visit continuityhousing.com or leave a comment in the survey if you're interested in how they can provide your critical employees guaranteed housing when they need it most. And be sure to watch the ACP website for future webinar information, and do send us your ideas for topics. As a reminder, this and previous webinars are recorded, made available on the ACP website. Feel free to share the link to recordings with your peers, anyone you think might benefit from it. You'll receive a link to the recording after the webinar, along with additional information on topical content. And maybe most important, please, there's a very brief survey that pops up when you close your browser. Please take half a minute to answer the questions. It really helps us refine these productions. Again, from all of us with ACP, Continuity Housing, Christian with TierPoint, and ADG, ACP's headquarters, thank you and have a great day.